Record. Shalom, Erev Tov, good evening from Jerusalem, Israel. This is Lowell Joseph Gallen, founder of the Root and Branch Association Limited, established in 1981 in New York State, in the United States of America. I would like to welcome our viewers and listeners worldwide and our Zoom live studio audience to this evening's program in our Root and Branch Association Limited English Language Conference and Lecture Series, broadcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. And now celebrating our first quarter century, first 25 years, from January 1995 until 2020 today. Today is Wednesday, November 18th, 2020, in the Gregorian calendar, and the third day of Kislev, 5781, in the Hebrew Israelite calendar. We are in day 4 of 7 in our 7-day Shabbat week count. This Shabbat, our Torah reading is Parshat Toledot, and we are in year 6 of our current 7 Shemitah sabbatical year cycle. We are broadcasting from the land of Israel, city of God, Jerusalem, hill of the priests, Givat Hanania Abu Tur, overlooking Mount Moriah, where the third and final Israelite temple of Jerusalem will soon be under reconstruction and stand forever, as per the prophet Ezekiel's vision. Please see the book of Ezekiel, chapters 40 through 48. The Root and Branch Association Limited promotes the study and practice of universal Israelite Jewish teachings within the framework of the Universal Noahide Covenant and laws. Please see the biblical book of Genesis, chapter 9, and affirmation of God's land, Torah, and people covenants with his chosen people, Israel. Our speaker for this evening's program is Jeff Friedman, who will speak about engaging with unfinished stories, legacies, narratives, and conflict management. Now I would like to welcome our program chair, Dr. Les Glassman, who will introduce Jeff Friedman.
Thank you so much, Lowell. It's a great honor and privilege to introduce Jeff Friedman. Jeff, I was going through your bio and your CV, and the truth is I could spend the entire evening just discussing your achievements. You have a very impressive and a very illustrious CV, actually, but I'm just going to give a brief summary, and we really await your presentation tonight. So, in brief, you're a very resourceful, industrious, and creative experienced therapist with multifaceted networking and business development experience with NGOs, government setting, and companies. You excel at drawing on the expressive arts as a mode of psychotherapeutic intervention. You handle extreme stress and rapid change with plum, trained in mediation and negotiation. Your particular strengths include building resiliency in trauma, survivors, identifying and growing strategic relationships in client-based project coordinations and problem solving. You are very skilled at opening doors and building connections, multicultural experience with children, adolescents, and adults, and you embrace new challenges, which I think is so important for today and for everyone. Now, your education, it's also very impressive. You study social work at Yeshiva University, and you have a BA in psychology at Queens College in New York. I'm just going to give a little brief, again, your professional affiliations. You are associated with the Union of Social Workers in Israel, the Israel Association and Family and Couple Therapy, Israel Mediation Groups, members of the Israel Painters and Sculptures Association, and members of the International Association of Art. And what's also very impressive is the publications that you have a chapter in And I read it. It's an incredible book, which I highly recommend. Resting with the Angel, Jewish Insights on Death and Mourning. And it was published by Stockholm Books in 95. And this is something that we would love you if you could speak a bit about tonight. You have a book that is awaiting publication. It's called The Flying Chair, an illustrated short story about two brothers coping with their parents getting divorced, which I think is a fascinating subject. And we really look forward to hearing your presentation tonight. So without any further ado, it's a great honor and a privilege to introduce you, Jeff Friedman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glassman and Lowell. And it's very exciting for me to be, even despite the fact that it's on Zoom, it's a new experience for me to speak in this forum and certainly to become acquainted with Root and Branches. I'll open up my, I guess, talk or presentation with the choice of the topic. I often, coming from this field, and perhaps we all ask ourselves at different points in our lives, is there what is the thread, the nature of the thread that connects us from our past to our present, what we do? I've also been very fascinated with the ideas that that we are born, when we are born in this world, we are already born into an existing story. And we all have our stories, and we all have the families that we're born into, and the nation we're born into. But I'm going to focus a little bit more on the subjective stories. I'll just briefly introduce, add some information. I was born in New York, in Brooklyn, to parents who were from Czechoslovakia. They were Holocaust survivors, from Hasidic families. We did not grow up Hasidic, but the music was I was very connected to that. And I moved to Israel about 40 years ago. I'm married, have 5 kids. I feel very privileged that that became part of my life and life story. And it very much was informed, the move coming from my background. But what I do presently is, Dr. Glassman mentioned about conflict resolution. I work with the courts here. One of the things I do is I'm working divorce mediation, and with high conflict post-divorce or pre-divorced parents who have children. And because of the nature of their dynamics, they have difficulty making decisions regarding the welfare of the child. And the courts are very overwhelmed by this, and they an expertise was developed from that need to mediate between parents. So that's my present work, and I'm going to connect it because sometimes these cases can be difficult, and I say, how did I get here? How am I doing these? But you know, so the following, I grew up, as I said, in Brooklyn, and I grew up with my father as a young boy. Used to wake me up with his tefillin every day, and he would say what I recall as a brief prayers. I would get up, and he would wind up his tefillin, and he would have a ritual. Every day he would walk out a little small room, and he would walk to one end of the room every day, and he would approach a frame, a picture in a frame that he hung up, and in the frame was a picture of a little girl, and he would go to this picture, and he would give a kiss to this little girl in a sled. And I would watch this, and I sensed I couldn't. It was not comfortable for me to ask him who this girl was, and I assumed it was just from from that other world which was untouchable, unbridgeable. But he had me watch this um, till I was about 14. When we moved, and he passed away when I was 15. And after he passed away, I found photographs of an entire family he had. He actually had a few kids. It was not an uncommon story for survivors to have had children, rebuilt second families. And at that time, they didn't really speak. Many families spoke about it. Some families, many did not. The family I came from did not really talk about this. But I was left with this kind of image of my father wanting me to observe this other world, this relationship to this girl, without words, without saying who she was. Now, years, of course, after he passed away, I found out he had another family, and I found other photographs, and I started collecting these other photos. I found 2 photographs of his children, but I was always left very strongly imprinted by the image of him approaching this picture, and the ritual of him having some kind of grief. I don't know what it was. I guess he didn't have a chance to really, separate or mourn. But my father was a very beautiful singer. He sang. He had a beautiful voice, and he sang nigunim. And he didn't speak very much to me about his past life, but he sang. And the singing was very, very strong. It's very in me, and accompanied me. Music has accompanied me much in my life. And so after he passed away, just very quickly, I'll say I became a ben bayit, which in Hebrew means I kind of adopted another family, my friend's family. I was very connected to my friend's family, who were American born, a very interesting family. The father was an off-Broadway actor. They were artists. The mother was a psychologist. And their discussion was very, very interesting. They spoke about their childhood and about the internal world. And it was a real introduction to me to see how they were able to manifest by paintings or by discussion the inner world. And for me, who came from this family who didn't speak, it was eye-opening that there was one can access and give representation to the inner dimensions of one's world. And so I got very interested in the whole field of psychology and expressive arts. When I moved to Israel in 1983, I taught music therapy as a beginning job at a college. And then I started working in the field of expressive therapies. Without going too deeply into what that is exactly, I paralleled a process of understanding how to use one's imagination to enhance the dialogue of situations in one's life that may have been not completed. In my case, my father passed away. He had this experience with another family. There were so many questions that I would have liked to have asked him. And I devoted a kind of a work at the time, after I kind of learned tools of how to engage in imaginary dialogue, much like story writing and writers. an imaginary dialogue with him already after I had kids. Um, I have here, I'll just show you, this was the photograph of his daughter, one of his kids, in my room. That was when and he would approach this little girl, every day, and he would have this parting ritual with her. I later found another photo of either another girl or, um, and then it dawned on me these were half sisters. They were not present and not present. Now, we all have families that are present and not we grow up, people pass away. Does the relationship end with someone who passes away? These are rhetorical questions that I would like to just invite the audience, because everyone has the experience as we grow older, and we're blessed with growing older, to go through the life cycle and deal with people who have passed away. But as long as we're alive, we have a relationship to those that have gone. I'll just quickly show you here. This was a painting I did of my dad, my father. Here, that was him, and I tried to imaginatively connect him to his daughter, and create a kind of dialogue with him around her, and I wrote, actually spent a year, I wrote kind of a play about it, imagining how we might respond. Now, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I want to give this just as a background of what was interesting to me in terms of the stories that we're born into, how they inform and shape who we are, and the choices we make. For me, coming to Israel is directly connected to my parents wanted to make Aliyah in the late 60s, and my father passed away. They actually bought an apartment in Netanya at the time. Then my father, but even in his will, he said if he doesn't make it here, he'd like to be buried here. I think he felt this was the right continuity for his personal story, his religious story, and I went along with that. I made conscious choices. America is a great country, and it was not bad. I didn't make Aliyah out of a negative reason. I really lived with the question of what are you supposed to do in this life as a response to whatever stories whatever how you're engaging your personal history and how you make choices. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears now into being in Israel, which is a very different entity than a community person in the United States. When you come to Israel, you realize, wait a minute, it's not just one Ashkenazi or just Sfaradi. It's a world here of many peoples who are Jewish. It's a country. I served in the army here as a mental health officer and got exposed to people from Kafkaz, Ethiopia, Russians. Very, very interesting, and it was very, very mind-opening and very transformative into the transition from a local culture in Brooklyn to a broader culture. And I was very fortunate to have a profession that enabled me to engage in the population here. And somehow I got involved with mediation work in the 90s. I was trained in divorce mediation, one of the first places that did it in Israel. And I became an expert in children of divorce and also expressive therapies. That was using psychotherapy. And when I started to do the mediation work, one of the challenges that you do is everyone has a different story. When you work with a couple, there are competing narratives about what happens in a particular family. That's the nature of a conflict. Everyone has their own narrative. And as the mediator, how do you work with narratives that are competing in a way that tries to locate the points of interest for both parties? Of course, children in this case are the points of interest. And part of the art of doing this kind of work is understanding that the nature of what you do is not judging, but yet not judging each side, but focusing on the joined interest, which in this case are the children. And you must guide the discussion toward the child and disengage the narratives that are conflicting, that cause the problem. That's the teachings, the Torah on one leg of the mediation work. But as I looked back in the years of how I got here to do this, I keep thinking that the whole idea of a bridge, of living between stories, because that's really where my focus is when I do the mediation. You're living between stories because that's what the child is. Child experiences two different stories, and you're trying to make it a comfortable space for the child to develop. And when I go back and I think about my own history and the space that my father, when he had this ritual with his daughter, it was I wasn't mediating, but I was almost placed in a observing status that he wanted me to participate in. At that time, I think he was working through his mourning grief, even though it was many years later. And the work with mediation and divorce has much to do with how a couple mourns the separation and the loss of a relationship. It's very similar to grief processes of Kubler-Ross, of the 5 stages of denial and bargaining and depression and until one reaches acceptance, and they don't have to go in that order. But basically, it's about separation and loss as a theme. And I think of my dad as a separation. He had a separation and loss from his family. And I think of my function coming into the world after that, experiencing, I should say my mother also was from Czechoslovakia and also had her losses. And I feel very fortunate, even though it was a sad story. They had wonderful families before they came from wonderful families, and I felt that from them. But all of us have heard much of the Holocaust growing up as Jews and living certainly in Israel. But the subject of how to manage separation and loss is something that really accompanies all of us in different ways, and not only tragic ways in life, but as part of our life cycle. We're going to always have this relationship and a separation, and how do you manage loss? And I see those themes as something that accompanies myself, that is accompanying me in life, and I'm trying to find the right aesthetic, if I could use that term, of how to do that, how to both help others do it and how to do it myself. I mentioned earlier that my father sang, and he really sang very beautifully. He didn't talk about his experience with his family and his daughter, but he had a beautiful, beautiful melody. And I'll end the talk with one of the melodies that he had. And it was Hasidic Nigun. And with your permission, I'll sing a little bit of it. I heard it once a week on a cup. He would sing it and would fall asleep on a cup of tea. And it would go like this. It would go, lie da die, lie da die, lie, 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 la, 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 dum, la, 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 lie, 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 lie. And I think I'll end with that melody. I would just say, when I was very young, when I was 6 or 7, he would say, "I want you to hear these melodies. I'm not going to be here forever." And and uh, and I feel, again, thank you. I feel very privileged here to be on the show, live in Israel, even though these themes seem very heavy. They're actually uh, um, very, again, I feel very fortunate to have had this profession in this country. Thank you.
Uh, Jeffrey, this has been really such an amazing, moving, and emotional talk that you've given, and it's really, really something exceptionally special. I've got 1 or 2 questions, if you don't mind, if I can ask you.
Sure.
Because I've had personally the great zchut, the great honor to interview. I'm very passionate about interviewing Holocaust survivors. So for me, your talk really, really resonates on many levels. And it's so beautiful how you took the lessons from your childhood and how you, not only did you make it into a career, but you've lived it, and you've actually taken the positive and you've used it in such an incredible positive manner to help people, and to your parents must be so proud of you, because you really, it's such an incredible thing that you've done, and it's amazing. I'm in awe when I listen to your story and your nigun that your father taught you, that I'm sure you are teaching your children and passing it on to the next generations. Wow, may the memories be for eternal blessing. But this has been an incredible, special presentation that you've given.
Thank you
Wow,
so much.
I'm really moved by it, and it was really, really. There are no words, because you gave such from the heart. It's all from the heart.
I would agree completely with Les, but you wanted to say something in response, Jeff, so I'll wait till you're done before I give my comment.
The only comment I would have is, I made a decision not to get caught up in forgetting and denying that happened, that the Holocaust happened, but from a place of not just an intellectual place, but more, how am I connected to that story? What am I supposed to do in this life that's related to that experience. I felt a kind of calling in that direction. And not only just moving to Israel. That was one level. Creating meaning from that, creating positive meaning.
Jeff, can I just ask you on this, Lal, and then I'll give through to you. Did you have a desire to ask your parents about their history, or was it a subject that you know that you couldn't have approached because it would have hurt them, or it was something that was, in a way, you just felt uncomfortable approaching because you know it would upset your parents and rather not go there? Or were your parents open to you asking?
My parents, I don't think I even heard of the word Holocaust until, after high school. I mean, there was always a feeling there, and I knew there was a war, and my mother would have these, for the yurt sites, like so many candles, and there's a lot of feeling, but they did not want to talk about it. They were incredible people. They were they were functioned well, but there was no personal talk about this, which I won't go into as a psychologist, a psychotherapist. But there's a lot to say about that. And I'm trying to, I think I'm spending my life trying to fill that void that was a legacy that was left. And I used to think they didn't bury the dead. Ribono Shel Olam, God, they did not bury their dead. He couldn't bury this little girl. And I researched, there was a Rembrandt did a beautiful painting of Yaakov blessing his kids before he died, which was such a privilege to bless your children before they die. It's a real full cycle of living and dying well. And they were not left with that privilege. So my father, I see him, the image of him kissing his daughter was the was the place that he was left with. That was not complete. So in terms of my parents, no, my later in my 20s, 30s, my mother would open up much more and tell me. My father died when I was 15. I couldn't ask him, obviously. And so that's why when I got the tools, the psychological tools of psychodrama and how to evoke imaginative dialogue, I would engage him in an imaginative discussion to complete that unfinished story.
And Jeff, can I ask you, did your parents, were a lot of their friends also Holocaust survivors? Did they mix in circles where,
yes,
a lot of families, they gravitated towards other people that were in similar situations? And
they definitely have all of my family, my close family were, but I had cousins who lived who were American born, but my mom had American friends too. She was very creative. She was she made her a dressmaker. She made clothing, and she was very creative. But yeah, I often feel like I have no contact with that culture. Wow, I grew up with them. We're, occasionally here. I'm in Israel now 40 years. So some of my neighbors were survivors and coming from that area. So it was kind of, I did have some contact over the years, but yeah, so many of their friends and circles were survivors, but some were not as well.
Okay, and then my last question on this topic, it's very interesting when you speak to a lot of families that came from Antwerp, from Belgium. They were they came to Antwerp after the war, and I think it was, without exception, those that I've spoken to, They never discussed it with their children.
Yeah.
Children, it was a subject that just wasn't discussed. The children were brought up very normally, and in those days there weren't psychiatrists and psychologists to explain
Yep.
to the parents what to do and how to bring up their children. But they brought up their children, and I've met many, and many are patients of mine, and they are unbelievably normal, with very little hang-ups. And looking back, their parents didn't discuss it till much, much later when they were grown up and they were married. In your opinion, what do you think would be better? Okay, looking back, that the parents did discuss it with the children, or
Yeah.
that
Very
they.
good question. Well, there's, I think in order to discuss any topic, and it doesn't only have to be about Holocaust, you have to do it well. You need to have, um, you need to be in a good place to contain a discussion. A lot of these families, including my mother's, my parents, were very functional. They functioned well. My father had he had a sweater factor. He made a nice living. He was very well liked. He had a business. He was a lot of the people from I don't know Antwerp specifically, but very high functioning on the level of how to get by. In terms of feelings, feeling vulnerability could have been perceived as weakness. And there may have been a lot of fear of opening up grief that would be overwhelming. So they couldn't do that. They had to function. They started new lives. And they had to, and they didn't have the psychological insights or help that everyone has today. I think my story is I was a little bit of an aberration in the sense that after my father died and I got involved with this, my friend's family, the mother was a psychologist, kind of shocked me into a different kind of world and a different kind of level of discussing things that I was not used to. It was not so easy. It was very difficult. But I think there was maybe the problem side is that there may be high functioning, but somehow vulnerability was equated with weakness, whereas the teachings in psychology, if you could sustain and contain your vulnerability, that's actually a formula for being able to be intimate with someone. There is a sensitivity and intimacy in vulnerability. So it's, but it was necessary, and whoever needed to repress and keep their feelings hold their feelings. There was a reason they needed to do that. And there were other families that were overwhelming and just couldn't keep it in. And I know many stories of people that were children that were overwhelmed by the stories, and it was too much.
Yeah, yeah.
Jeff, the issue of vulnerability is a critical one for Jews. The idea that if I express vulnerability, especially if I'm living in a Gentile host society and I'm not useful to my host society, that may have terrible consequences. I know a man who was a journalist and he had to escape Austria in the Anschluss in 1938 with his wife and children. They were from very upper middle class, aristocratic Jewish families that had come 100 years earlier to Vienna. He was a captain in the cavalry in World War I. And I asked him, he was an economic journalist, went all over Europe, and I said, did you have any idea, of course it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, what was coming with the Nazis? And I'll never forget what he told me. He said, we thought they would need us. In other words, if I have a professional degree or an academic degree or a business, I'm contributing to my host society. You're not going to gas me, burn me, drown me, bury me alive in a pit. I'll be useful. This comes through very clearly in Schindler's List, the movie Schindler's List, where some ladies are in their barracks and they're discussing what are the Nazis going to do. And one lady says to the other lady, well, you know, I've been, some rumors got around, they want to murder us all. And the first lady says to the second lady, oh, but we'll be useful to them. And this is a very dangerous line of thinking, which is, well, we'll be useful, where it becomes critical for Jews and Israelis or anyone to understand what do people believe and to what extent will they act on their beliefs, so that Jews could find out, yes, we were useful in the Lodz ghetto making uniforms for the Germans, and we were useful for the SS in Auschwitz making soap and lampshades. So this, I found, talking to Jews and Israelis, is a real problem, especially for what we would call neurotypicals, which is reality is what I want it to be. When you're dealing with people in the Gentile world, for example, who will act on their beliefs, and those beliefs may be genocidal, not understanding those beliefs can have terrible consequences. So the one thing I've seen as a survival mechanism in the Jewish world is a staggering amount of pretending, lying, and make-believe, which is, I may be on a train to Treblinka. Maybe we're always on the train to Treblinka. All I know is Brent steht Brent. So to dope myself up for a few more hours until I'm gas burned or shot, I'm going to pretend to myself, they don't really mean it. They don't really want to do it. That's just conspiracy theory. This is maybe some way of dulling the pain before you get off the train to Treblinka and go to your deaths, but it's not very good for long-term survival. And I've read stories of people who came to, in Hungary, at the very end of the war, when the Horthy government was bad, but it wasn't as bad as the Nazi Hungarian government that followed. We come to Jewish village and say, even Gentiles, you have to escape immediately. You have to go. You have to leave your villages, run over the border to Romania, run up in the mountains. They're gonna murder you. And the Jews in the villages says, what? That's a conspiracy theory. You crazy? They're not going to really do that. And they didn't go. So the issue of telling stories, not telling stories, vulnerability, maybe vulnerability is dangerous, is a real issue. I know I've been here in Israel 28 and a half years. We came on April 1st, 1992. And as the Oslo death process developed into a national catastrophe, I listened to people, very educated people, with a pretending, lying, make-believe that Jews are so good at, either to ensure our survival or to dull our pain before we're machine gunned into Babi Yar. And they went on for years pretending we have a peace process that's not working until the Gush Katif expulsion. And after that, the best explanation I've read for what happened came from a place, Global Resources, run by Professor Michel Chossudovsky, who's Jewish on his father's side. His father was a real Russian revolutionary. As Rabbi Kahane said, a Jew is a crusader for every cause except his own. His was the Palestinian people. Never mind, there is no such thing. And the mother is Irish. But there's good material on Global Resources. And one essay one person wrote, and I thought said E equals MC squared in one sentence, cut through all the gefilte fish and the BS that we read or hear in Jewish and Israeli media outlets. It was like this. Israel withdrew from Gush Katif, the rockets kept falling, and the left collapsed. Period. In other words, my ability to pretend and lie to myself has a limit. And for my Erev Rav regime to lie to me, yes, you have a peace process, has a limit. At a certain point, the make-believe breaks down in the face of shattering reality. So to sum up a long comment, which is that in terms of discussing or not discussing with children, traumas, tragedies, Pol Pot, disasters, mass murder, There's another issue of whether you discuss it or not, being able to, like a canary in the cage, say, where am I? What's really going on? And what should I do?
Um, okay, it's not a, you're making a comment more than a, there's no question behind you.
It's a comment.
You're saying you're saying there's a, the reality is that there's vulnerability, and there are mechanisms, you either deny that vulnerability, or embrace the vulnerability, if I hear you correctly. And your comment about the political, you're drawing in the politics of Oslo and etc. and Gush Katif, and you're saying that the response of the government toward the vulnerability was of a denial. It denied the promise of what that vulnerability would deliver. So, if I hear you correctly, you're saying vulnerability is very tricky because if the true state nature is vulnerability, then how do you respond to that? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And this professor, Dr. Fritz Kaufman of blessed memory, who told me his stories, they told me many stories, and one of which was that when they were in Berlin in the 1930s, early 1930s, he was a correspondent for his newspaper in Vienna. It was a Jewish-run newspaper, and his wife was very goyish looking with curly blonde hair and blue eyes. And once an SA unit was passing by them sitting in a cafe, and she and her husband were laughing at them, and one of the SA men said, "Rassenschandler, racial traitor, we will get you." And what she said to me was, we lived in Berlin, 1930, 1933. She said, I couldn't understand. And she was from a very, very wealthy Jewish family from Vienna and very assimilated. But they had some sense of Jewish identity. She said, I couldn't understand how, in a situation of terrible economic, social depression in Germany, from the crash in 29 till Hitler's rise in 1933, up to the last minute, the rich Jews of Berlin continued totally oblivious to what was around them, with the most revolting, conspicuous consumption and ostentation, that didn't they have a sense of danger that you don't want to flaunt your wealth when millions of people are unemployed. They don't like you anyway, thanks to Christian traditions. And now they're really in a mess. You want to flaunt your wealth and show off? This is a recipe for an explosion. And there was the explosion. She said, I couldn't understand that reaction. In many ways, Jews in Arab countries are far more intelligent. For example, your home may be beautiful inside, but in the outside, like for Jews in Yemen, it looks like anyone else's hovel. You don't provoke the Muslims by showing how rich you are. And I would say the same thing to the Jews in America now, in a very unstable situation. Do you really want to have 3 Cadillacs on the driveway? Or, well, I grew up in an Italian, mixed Jewish Italian neighborhoods. The Jews maybe had the BMWs and Mercedes, the Italians had the Cadillacs. How many cars? 1, 2, 3, 4. Is that a good idea? I don't think so. And therefore, being able to discuss vulnerability and relate it to reality can be life and death. Also, Dr. Kaufman told me that when he and his wife, they escaped from Austria to Prague, then they flew to Switzerland, they ended up in France, then the Nazis invaded, then they up in Vichy France and southern France. He had a very good radar for trouble. And he was sitting in a cafe, and he was looking at the local newspaper, and he saw something where they started the roundups of Jews or registered names. And he said, Lena, we leave today. And they left Marseille, went to Casablanca, you know, the movie with Humphrey Bogart. And then thanks to Varian Fry, who was a pro-Jewish Gentile diplomat, 1,000 visas were issued for European intellectuals. They really meant Jews, but didn't want to say that. His job was to get them into the country. Dr. and Mrs. Kaufman got one of those visas, and before America went to war with Germany, was on a ship and ended up in New York. So his radar, with a doctorate in economics and having traveled all over Europe, he saw something in the paper. He said, that's not good. Lena, we leave today. And they survived in America. So this relates to the issue of vulnerability, and you can talk, you can't talk. When is not talking a luxury? And when is being able to talk a survival mechanism? Not just in case of how you'll feel, but literally whether you'll live or die, period.
Yeah, well, you bring up, there are some, different, the examples you're bringing up have different themes to it. One is, how do you read reality in the present,
Right.
when it's happening? Like the example of leaving a place. And then it's about, how do you talk about something post-trauma, after the situation happened? When recalling a trauma or a dangerous situation evokes feelings of vulnerability. I think in my personal story, that was more of the case. They were in America at the time, but do you, so I would make a distinction between, at least for the sake of this discussion, when I say vulnerability, as more in terms of memory and processing events that happened, rather than how do you function when things happen in the moment and in a live way. I think that has to do with being alert and being adaptive. I would use that word. How do you adaptivity is in your example of how they left when they felt threatened. That was an adaptive function. They were vulnerable, but they were adaptive. They were able to make a decision. So I remember hearing Elie Wiesel once say they were, we had many students, and they couldn't. Remember, this one student kept saying to him, "I can't get myself around this. Why didn't the Jews know this was happening? Why couldn't they just leave? Why couldn't?" And his answer was that the Jewish culture, the way they were educated, the way the Jews were educated, they would never even imagine that something like this could happen. It couldn't even go up to the Zelo ole ala dat, we say in Hebrew. You couldn't even think about it. It wasn't in our education, in the Jewish education, that such an horrendous thing could be possible. So here we are, post-Holocaust, and we're in Israel, and we have an army. There've been wars, and there've been traumas, and there've been wake-ups, and we're in a different place. How is that managed? How do you manage that tension between being not in Europe, being in the Middle East, being with an Arab population, being with Arab neighbors? Those are the new kinds of challenges we have. I'm participating now in a program. I got invited to it. It's funded by the European Union. It's a binational psychotherapy program for mental health experts in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority, and Israel, Jews and Muslims, and also some Christians. We are all studying written materials on psychology, psychotherapy, but having contact around different cultures, and it's very, very interesting, the contact. When we come from America, you said you grew up in an Italian Jewish neighborhood, and you had contact with different ethnicities, and in Israel, it's a very different.
Right.
We're in a very different reality here, and how we manage that is a great challenge. I don't have any clear answers, and but but certainly I think, and often ideology, whether it's extreme left or extreme right, um, challenge the ability to have the adaptivity that you need to discern what's the right response to a particular situation. Um, anyway, um,
I can tell you what Arab Christian and Arab Muslim told me.
mhm.
Up until March, I would do my work in cafes or bar cafes. And one of them, I don't want to say the name in case people could be identified. I said to at a certain point, I got to know most of them by name, and I said to one of the Arab waiters, I said, you know, I really admire, he was a Muslim. I said, I admire your society. You have such strong extended families, your hamulot, and you help each other, especially for a married couple to buy a home. And he said, you think so? And I said, yes. He said, let me tell you something. He said, let me tell you the difference between my culture, my Arab Muslim Hamullah culture. Yes, we do that. Everybody gives the money from their salary to the patriarch, and then the patriarch spreads it back to all the members who have their little homes in our little villages. He said, that's nice, right? I said, yes. He said, you know what? I prefer your culture to my culture. I said, why? He said, because in my culture, after about 5 or 10 minutes, when we have a dispute in a family, we take out the knives and the guns. In your culture, you kvetch and scream and push and shove. He said, I prefer kvetching and pushing and screaming and shoving to knives and guns. That's what the Muslim told me. What did the Arab Christian tell me? Also waiter at the same restaurant, cafe, bar, where for 12 shekels, I could get a nice coffee. And they always gave me all sorts of cookies because they liked me and I didn't pay for them. So I said, tell me something. What would happen, you're Arab Christian. What would happen if today all the Jews disappeared? We died, we left. What would happen to the Arab Christians? He said, I'll tell you what would happen. Historically, we have been protected from our charming, wonderful Arab Muslim brothers and sisters by the Turks, the British, the French, and you. He said, if you would all be gone today from the land of Israel, tomorrow the massacres, rapes, and expulsions would start for us, as you've seen all over the Middle East. Why? Because they are envious and jealous of us because we're better educated, which is true, and we are more prosperous. And they would steal our land and our homes and our property. And if we're lucky, we wouldn't be dead. That's what the Arab Christian told me and the Arab Muslim told me. So there, again, the perception of what's real and what's not real. There was a terrible example within the last year or two where, I don't think naive is the right word, it's a couple from Norway or somewhere in Europe. They wanted to drive on a motorcycle, their bicycles through Tajikistan to show we love the local people. And the local people took them and murdered them. Thank you for coming here. You're infidels. Tajikistan is Shiite. Now, I'm not saying this is all Tajiks, but members of a extreme group there said, oh, you coming here? Thanks for coming to visit. And they killed them. So perceptions and misperceptions of reality, again, not just for us, for anyone, anywhere, are life and death. And that's also why your studies, in my opinion, are so important, because to bring a positive note here, we believe that if one is from a traditional religious perspective, the Messianic era is emerging and the land of Israel will be a center for Torah teachings to go out to the world. And every man will sit under his vine and his fig tree and none will make them afraid. And in Isaiah 11, the cow and the wolf and the lion will feed together and a little child will lead them. They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That's wonderful. That didn't quite happen yet. But that is the vision of what's coming, so that Jewish is Israelite, or Israel is the center of social welfare teachings, the kind of things you're engaged in to go out to the world to heal people. Of course, right here we have to do that physically, mentally, and spiritually are so important. That's why I'm very much in favor of Israel medical tourism, social welfare tourism, cry on my shoulders tourism. That's what the children of Israel are meant to be. So this issue also of the Holocaust, it's not a private family affair, but it applies to everybody. The stories of what happened to us should be a model, and also how we deal with them for people. Let's say you're in Rwanda, where 900,000 Tutsis were massacred by the Hutus, or you're in Cambodia, where Pol Pot decides, and didn't even pretend he didn't do it, I'm going to kill off a third of my population for whatever reasons he had to do that. Those people can look to us for inspiration, where how do you deal with, or Armenians with the Turks, extreme tragedies and catastrophes. That's why I think it's so important, the kind of work that you're doing. And again, what the Arab Christians said to me, and Gentiles have said, you are a sea of light. You are a beacon of light in a sea of Arab and Muslim darkness and horror, and the rest of the world too. One more point. Sometimes people get bitchy about Israel and say, you're persecuting Christians in the land of Israel. So I saw this once on a social connected media site, where the owner, who is very proud to be a Christian, said, it's only in a country with deep Christian roots where Christians can be safe. Now, this person is a real Jew hater, and I caught him once. And I said, well, let me ask you something. I won't say his name. There are very few countries in the world today, including the United States, where Christians haven't been massacred in their churches. In the 70 years of the Zionist state of Israel, there is not a single instance ever of any Christian having been massacred in any church. It never happened. There was silence. It just made him angry because he didn't want to be reminded of that. Now, why the Israeli government doesn't point these things out, I gave up wondering why they do or don't do it. It's an IQ problem. I just gave up on them. I just do what I do. I don't no longer wonder why people in the Israeli and Jewish world do or don't do or say or don't say. Why don't you point that out? That's not a minor point. For 70 years, there's never been a massacre of any Christian in any church ever anywhere in the land of Israel. One asked the Copts in Egypt about, I know a young Coptic boy here, said it's routine there. We never know what's coming. We have no self-defense units, and the government does or does not protect us. And you're living like Jews in the 1880s in Tsarist Russia. He said, yes. He was very glad to be here. I said, you ever had any problems here? Anyone burn down your churches or burn you in your churches? No. So these are facts about the state of Israel the way it is. It's not the Messianic kingdom yet, but it has very powerful, these are facts which can't be told enough. And that what you're doing is so important, I think.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm not doing any mediation on that level of political mediation, but when you get into the small places, little stories, then and you move away from you need both pictures. You need the larger picture and you need smaller pictures, and sometimes I kind of learned to appreciate paradox as a sign that reality sometimes brings to us that is true. There are paradoxes that make it difficult to read and make absolute statements about reality. Sometimes reality is paradoxical, and that's not a bad thing. But yeah, look, we all hope that things will be resolved, and the whole situation here will be improved, uh, and I'm all for this country and its presence, and for finding ways um, that we learn how to retain ourselves, who we are, our purpose, and also live in relation to the Arab world around us. Um, and thank God there weren't, as you say, the massacres and those kinds of things under our rule. And we're struggling to figure this out. Very complicated situation, from within, from without. So, yeah, um, yeah. Well, anyway, thank you, Lo.
Can I just make just a comment, observation? The comment that you mentioned about that student that with Elie Wiesel, just when you were speaking about, and he said like, why didn't the Jews like do something, or why didn't they, didn't they know what was happening to them? The truth is, the deception was so enormously great that people that I've actually interviewed, till they were in the line with Mengele, they didn't know that there were chimneys ahead. They didn't know what right or left meant. There were people that were sent postcards. The Germans were incredibly masterful in the deception.
Mm.
And even a big observation was that there was nowhere to go. Where could they go? And all the countries closed their borders. They had really nowhere to go. So they were in a no-win situation, and it wasn't so simple, and it isn't so simple. And those that went into hiding, or those that felt like Lowell, you were mentioning in Germany, I mean, we had 2,000 years of like persecution, and people hoped that this would be a passing phase, that the madman Hitler would he'd be voted out of office. People never would have imagined, like Vienna, when you go to Vienna and you go to parts of Germany, the most cultured countries in Europe could perpetrate the most hideous crimes in humanity. Who would have believed that the most cultural, classical musicians and professors, and a lot of Hitler's supporters were professors? Who would have dreamt that the most cultural two countries, Austria and Germany, would have perpetrated the greatest crime in humanity? It was unthinkable.
Yes.
And it still is unthinkable.
Yes, absolutely.
When you go to Vienna and you see the architecture and you see the beauty and you see the culture there, it's unthinkable that all the shuls, except for the great synagogue, which was in a courtyard with other buildings, were all destroyed on Kristallnacht. It's just unthinkable to think that such a thing happened, but it did happen.
Yeah.
So the people, what could they do? All the countries closed their borders. Thank God we've got, and this is what I have heard from a lot of the survivors, thank God we've got our own country. Thank God we don't have to rely on the nations, because we have a place where we can go. And the saddest thing is from a very close friend of mine who passed away 4 months ago, who was in the Kovna ghetto, and then he was later in Dachau, said, if only we had our country 10 years before. If only we had our country 10 years before. Like if only 1948 and 38, said my mother and my brother wouldn't have been murdered. And that's it. But, what I would like to just mention with you, Jeff, is that have you ever, I look forward to seeing your book on divorce and the two brothers writing about divorce, which is fascinating. But your life story and what you've taken from your parents, wow, that would be, it's unique, because you've taken a difficult situation and you've made it into the most positive situation. So I think that would make an incredible, incredible book.
I guess you're right. Thank you for the idea.
And I would love to one day just interview you, just because your story is so moving and so touching, and you really, I think what you've done is remarkable. It really is remarkable.
Thank you.
You've made something so positive out of something that was very difficult. And kol hakavod to you, really. And kol hakavod to you, Lowell, for organizing this incredible evening. It's been
Thank-
such an honor and a privilege to be part of it.
That's because I met Lowell at one of those coffee houses that he talks about.
No, it's been exceptionally special. And Jeff, if I
Thank
could
you,
speak
Liz,
to
and
you,
thank you so much for the encouragement. I would like to do that. I really feel I would like to start presenting some. I feel I have a lot to say about what um, what I think and feel about this my experience with my family and.
well, I would love to actually
Maybe
interview
I'll write a
you.
book.
Just
All right.
to video you telling it with the pictures and you singing, because it is, you can learn so much from what you say, really, and what you've experienced. And a second generation, I mean, you were there. Your parents were, you're very close. You're very close to it, and
Yeah.
you've taken a very positive. You've learned the positive lessons from it, and if everybody can emulate you, really, it would be a better world. It really would.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm gonna. Yeah, I would like to do that. It's a good message for me. Thank you. I appreciate the encouragement and yeah.
So we'll be in touch, please, God.
Okay, terrific. Thank you again, and thank you, Lowell. Are we ending now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
wishing you all a Chodesh Tov, and Lowell,
Thank
thank you so much for organizing this Root and Branch Zoom talk tonight. It's been a tremendous honor and a privilege to be here tonight, really.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
Jeffrey,
so much.
really thank you so much for your inspirational talk. It really was. It was very,
Thank you so much.
very, very moving and very, very special.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lowell. All the best to you.
Okay, it's stop recording now, so we're off stage.